He sat down for dinner and two girls with his eyes and his birthmark walked up and said, "We think you're our dad." What they told him next changed everything. Graham Lawson had everything a man could want, at least that's what the headline said. Billionaire CEO, biotech innovator, one of the most powerful men in America. According to 3 different magazines, he was the kind of man who made people lower their voices when he entered the room. His sharp blue eyes could freeze a conversation mid-sentence, and the slight curl in his dark hair gave him a look that was both effortless and intimidating. He spoke only when necessary, smiled even less, and lived in a high-rise apartment that had more glass than furniture. Every inch of his life was polished, curated, and impenetrable, just the way he liked it. To the world, Graham was an untouchable force of nature, but what they didn't see was how empty the silence became once the boardroom lights were off. They didn't see how he sat in his penthouse every night sipping scotch he barely tasted, staring out over a city he helped shape but no longer understood. There were no picture frames in his home, no family photos, no childhood memories. He told himself that was by design, that cutting out the past made him sharper, faster, stronger. But some nights that silence turned into a weight so heavy it pressed into his chest until he couldn't breathe. There had been one person who got close: Avery Moore, a brilliant, fire-hearted researcher who challenged him in meetings and left handwritten notes on his desk instead of emails. She was unlike anyone he'd ever known, warm but not weak, bold but never loud. She didn't care about his money, didn't need it. They were together for almost 2 years, and for a moment in time Graham actually believed in something softer than ambition. But then just like that she was gone. No fight, no final words, just a note that read, "I have to go, please don't follow me." And he didn't, not because he didn't care, but because it shattered him more than he was willing to admit. In the 6 years since Graham buried that part of himself, he told no one, not even his assistant, who probably knew more about his life than his own family. Once had he poured everything into work, into empire building, into staying so busy that he didn't have time to ask the one question that haunted him every night: what happened to her? On paper he had built a perfect life, but perfection is a fragile thing, and all it takes is one crack for everything underneath to start seeping through. And the crack was coming, he just didn't know it yet. It was a Thursday evening, the kind that fell heavy and slow over the city like a velvet curtain. The sun had already sunk behind the skyline, leaving only a haze of orange lingering on the tips of skyscrapers. Graham Lawson had just left another board meeting that ended in applause and backpacks, the kind of performance he could now execute with his eyes closed. He didn't linger, he never did. Success to him was a rhythm, predictable, efficient, unfeeling. His driver knew the routine: no small talk, straight to the rooftop restaurant, tucked away in a private corner of the city, where the maitre greeted Graham by name and whisked him to his usual table without a menu. The restaurant was exclusive, quiet, designed for people who wanted elegance without intrusion. It was one of the few places where Graham could sit alone and not be bothered. That night the lighting was soft, the music tasteful, and the wine chilled exactly how he liked it. His steak arrived medium rare, and he opened his tablet, diving into numbers and projections like he did every night. He had just taken his second bite when it happened. 2 small figures appeared at the edge of his vision, standing quietly by his table. At first he didn't look up. He assumed it was a staff member's child, maybe a brief distraction that would be handled by management in seconds. But the silence stretched. There was no adult, no movement, just stillness. He raised his eyes. They were girls, young, maybe 6 years old. They stood shoulder to shoulder, identical in height and build, with long dark curls falling in soft waves past their shoulders. Their clothes were neat but simple, matching dresses in pale yellow with tiny blue bows at the collar. But what struck him immediately, what froze the breath in his lungs, were their eyes, bright, piercing blue. His blue. For a few seconds the world blurred around the edges. Everything, the candle light, the clinking of dishes, the faint hum of a jazz piano, faded into background noise. He blinked, unsure if this was some sort of hallucination or trick of the mind. Then one of the girls stepped forward. "Mr. Lawson," she said, voice small but clear, "we have something to show you." Graham didn't respond, couldn't. His hands were suddenly cold against the tablecloth. The second girl, mirroring the first, rolled up the sleeve of her dress. The first followed. On each of their left wrists a small crescent-shaped birthmark curved like a shadow of the moon. His heart skipped. He had the same mark. It wasn't something visible in suits and cufflinks, but it was there, etched into him since birth, something his mother used to call "your little moon." He had always hated it, thought it made him look flawed, but now seeing it duplicated on these 2 little girls, he felt like the earth had tilted under him. They stood there, silent, eyes searching his, not afraid, not begging, just waiting. He heard himself speak, though the voice didn't sound like his own. "Where's your mother?" One of them, Emma, though he didn't yet know her name, reached into a small purse slung over her shoulder and pulled out an envelope. She handed it to him with both hands, then stepped back beside her sister. The envelope was worn at the corners. His name was written on it in familiar, slanted Handwriting Avery's, his fingers trembled as he opened it. Inside a letter, one page, no introduction, no apology, just the truth delivered in Avery's steady, thoughtful voice. Even from the grave asterisk, if you're reading this it means I'm gone and they've found you there. Names are Sophie and Emma, they're 6, they are yours. Asterisk. Graham stared at the words, his vision blurred, the paper trembled. Asterisk. I never stopped loving you, but I had my reasons. You don't have to forgive me, just please take care of them. If nothing else, let them know they're not alone. Asterisk. He folded the letter with shaking hands and looked up at the girls again, still standing there, still watching him. They had the same eyes, the same birthmark, and now he knew with the kind of certainty that doesn't ask for DNA tests or legal documents. They were his. He didn't remember standing, he didn't remember leaving his food, his tablet, or his coat behind. He only remembered reaching out his hand and the moment Sophie took it without hesitation. That night Graham Lawson walked out of a restaurant a different man than the one who had entered. He walked out not as a billionaire, not as a CEO, not as a man in control of every variable. He walked out as a father, and he had no idea what to do next. The ride home was silent, not the tense kind of silence, not uncomfortable but thick with unspoken thoughts, questions too big for the moment, and emotions Graham wasn't ready to name. The girls sat in the back of the car side by side, hands folded neatly in their laps, their feet barely touching the floor. They didn't ask where they were going, they didn't seem afraid, and somehow that made it even harder to process. He kept glancing at them in the rearview mirror as if expecting them to disappear like a dream that made too much sense to be real. Back at his penthouse, the space felt too large, too cold, too adult for the presence of two small children. The lights flickered on automatically, revealing polished stone floors, high ceilings, and walls bare of any warmth. He realized for the first time just how sterile his life had become. Not a single photo, not a single toy, not a single soft surface. This was a place built for solitude, not for children, and now two of them stood in his foyer, looking around like they were visiting a museum. He gestured awkwardly toward the living room, not quite sure what to say. Make yourselves comfortable, he offered, knowing how ridiculous it sounded the moment it left his mouth. Sophie gave him a small polite nod and guided her sister forward, the protector even in unfamiliar territory. Emma clutched the small purse she brought and scanned the room with quiet curiosity. She looked at everything but touched nothing. Graham stood there for a long moment, frozen. He had faced down hostile investors, courtroom interrogations, government regulators, but this was terrifying, and it was only the beginning. Eventually he excused himself and retreated to his office, not to work but to breathe. He sat at his desk, opened the letter again and read it 5 times as if hoping the ink would rearrange itself into something easier to digest. The words didn't change, they never would. She'd kept this from him. Avery, he remembered the way she used to laugh when he got too serious, the way she could read his moods before he even knew he had one. She had always been so in control of herself, so deliberate in her choices, and now he understood leaving had been one of them. Not just leaving him but keeping the girls away, keeping him in the dark. He wanted to be angry, he was angry, but beneath it was something else, something heavier, regret for all the birthdays he missed, for the first steps, the first words, the skinned knees and lullabies he never got to sing. 6 years gone. He returned to the living room to find them exactly where he'd left them, sitting politely on the edge of the couch, hands still folded in their laps like they were waiting for someone to tell them what came next. He felt a pang so sharp it nearly buckled him. He sat across from them, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. I don't know how to do this, he said quietly. Neither of them answered right away. Then Sophie, the braver of the two, tilted her head slightly and asked, do you want us to stay here? He looked at her, those impossibly blue eyes, that mix of caution and courage, and felt something catch in his throat. I think I need you too, he said, voice rough. Emma finally spoke, then just one word, okay. It was so simple, so innocent, and it broke him wide open. That night he gave them the guest room down the hall, not because it was ready but because it had the softest mattress. He brought in extra blankets and set up a nightlight, unsure if they'd want it on. They thanked him, both of them, in those soft, careful voices that made it clear they were used to managing the feelings of adults. He stood outside their door for a long time after they'd gone to bed, listening to them whisper and giggle under the covers, not afraid, just small girls in a too big world. He didn't sleep. He sat by the window watching the city lights flicker in the distance. He was supposed to have everything, but now he saw the truth. What he built meant nothing if it couldn't hold the people who mattered. For the first time in years, Graham Lawson had someone to lose, and the weight of that truth was more terrifying and more beautiful than anything he'd ever known. Morning arrived, slowly bleeding in through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Graham's penthouse, illuminating the stillness of a home that had never truly been lived in. But this morning something was different. There were traces of Life in the air, small things barely noticeable to anyone else, a pair of tiny socks left in the hallway, a crumpled napkin on the coffee table, faint giggling behind a closed door. Graham hadn't slept, not really. He had dozed in the armchair by the window, haunted by the weight of what had happened, what was happening, and what he now had to become. Father, the word didn't feel real in his mouth, even as it echoed again and again in his mind. 6 years lost, 2 girls with his eyes, his mark on their skin. Sleeping under his roof and Avery gone. He got up slowly, stretching limbs that felt heavier than usual. As he passed the hallway to the guest room, he paused. The door was cracked open. Inside he saw Emma curled against her sister's side, thumb tucked near her mouth, hair spread like a halo on the pillow. Sophie was already awake, sitting up, arms wrapped around her knees, staring out the window. She noticed him but didn't say anything. He gave her a small nod, and she returned it with one of her own. That simple exchange said more than any words could have. He made breakfast, or at least he tried. The kitchen was designed by professionals but never used. He burnt the toast, undercooked the eggs, and gave up on the idea of making pancakes halfway through. Eventually he settled for pouring cereal into mismatched bowls and slicing a few pieces of fruit. When he set everything on the table, it looked oddly like something real, something domestic, something normal. The girls came out together, hand in hand. Emma rubbed her eyes. Sophie was quiet but alert. They sat, murmured soft thank yous, and began eating. No one spoke for a while, and for once the silence didn't feel empty. It felt tentative but alive, like a new song just beginning to play. After breakfast, Graham took a deep breath and did the one thing he knew he had to do next. He called his lawyers. The legal situation was a minefield. There was no formal record linking him to the girls yet. Avery had left the DNA results, yes, but that wasn't the same as filing for custody. If anyone contested his role, if family stepped in, if the state decided to intervene, it could all spiral out of his control. That possibility shook him more than he expected. He didn't just want them safe, he wanted them with him permanently. His legal team as always moved quickly, but even they couldn't work miracles overnight. They advised him to lay low, not alert any external parties, yet no media, no public appearances with the girls, not until the process started. In the meantime, they would begin drafting custody petitions and running background checks to make sure there were no legal surprises waiting to pounce. Graham thanked them, then hung up and leaned against the edge of the kitchen counter, suddenly overwhelmed. His world had always been numbers, control, precision. This was none of those things. This was 2 small humans depending on him for everything. This was schedules, emotions, school forms, scraped knees, bedtime stories, nightmares. This was real life. By midday he realized he needed help. He couldn't do this alone, not without turning the transition into a trauma for them. So he did something he hadn't done in years. He asked for support, not from friends, he didn't have many, but from the one person he trusted implicitly. Monica, his personal assistant, showed up within the hour. She was sharp, unshakable, and fiercely loyal. She took one look at the girls, then turned to Graham with a raised brow and said, "Well, that explains the 3 missed calls and the tone in your voice." He gave her the short version. Avery, the letter, the birthmarks, the DNA. Monica said nothing for a full 30 seconds, then she nodded once, adjusted her blazer, and said, "Okay, we've got work to do." They spent the rest of the afternoon reworking the penthouse. Monica made calls, ordered essentials, clothes, books, toys, furniture. Sophie and Emma followed her around shyly at first, but within an hour Emma was helping unpack boxes and Sophie had claimed a corner of the guest room as her reading spot. Graham watched all of it from the hallway, a strange warmth blooming in his chest. He didn't feel in control, but he didn't feel lost either. He felt included. That night he read to them. He wasn't sure how to pick a book, so he asked. Emma pointed to a story about a bear who lost his family and found a new one in the woods. Graham read slowly, his voice catching in places he didn't expect. The girls didn't notice, or maybe they did but chose not to say anything. When the lights were out and they were tucked under fresh blankets, he lingered at the door. "Do you want me to leave it open?" he asked softly. Sophie looked at him for a moment, then nodded just a little, so he left it open. Just a little later that night, alone again in the quiet of his room, he sat at the edge of his bed staring at the envelope. Avery had left the handwriting, the weight of the paper, the finality of it all. It still didn't feel real, and yet in the next room 2 pieces of that reality were breathing, dreaming, alive. Graham Lawson was many things: a billionaire, a leader, a man who built walls around his heart and called them strategy. But that night he was just a father, listening through a crack in the door to make sure his daughters were still there, and promising himself he would never let them go. The next week unfolded like a strange dream, one that drifted between wonder and quiet panic. Every morning Graham woke up with the same thought: they were still here, Sophie and Emma, his daughters. It was a fact he repeated to himself often, not because he doubted it, but because saying it helped him catch up to the reality that was moving faster than he could process. He had gone from solitary routines and boardroom presentations to school runs, spilled juice, bedtime negotiations, and two little girls who seemed to grow more real to him with every passing hour. He started learning their rhythms. Sophie liked order. She made her bed every morning without being asked, lined up her shoes perfectly by the door, and always double-checked her sister's backpack. She was cautious, always a little tense, as if still bracing for the moment when this new world would fall apart. Emma, on the other hand, was a wanderer, curious, imaginative, endlessly full of questions. She would trail behind him, asking things like why clouds didn't fall, or whether bears had birthdays, or if pancakes were better on Sundays than Saturdays. Her mind was always spinning, and Graham found himself wanting to follow her thoughts, just to remember what it felt like to wonder without limits. He tried to keep up, but the truth was he was in over his head. He read parenting articles at night, scribbled notes to himself about routines, nutrition, bedtime, consistency, emotional validation, whatever that meant, and still felt like he was failing. The girls weren't asking for perfection, but inside he was terrified of messing this up, of giving them a glimpse of something safe only to have it taken away again. He was also terrified of something far more vulnerable, that he was starting to love them in ways he hadn't known he was capable of. It was in the middle of this slow transformation, just as Graham began feeling a fragile confidence, that the first wave of threat rolled in. It came in the form of a letter delivered by courier, printed on expensive legal stationery. The name at the top made his blood freeze. Daniel Moore, a verse brother. He hadn't seen Daniel in years, not since before she left back then. The man was already bitter, controlling, deeply judgmental of her choices. Graham had never liked him. Avery rarely spoke of him now. It seemed Daniel had discovered that his sister had passed and that her children were with Graham. The letter was brief but sharp, a formal request for custody evaluation. Daniel believed he was the rightful guardian. He claimed Graham was unfit, emotionally unavailable, and never involved in their upbringing. Worse, the letter hinted at possible media exposure if Graham didn't respond. Graham stood in his office staring at the paper, rage rising like a tide. He wasn't afraid of a courtroom, but this wasn't about business. This was about Sophie and Emma, about their home, their safety, their future, and someone wanted to rip it away. He called Monica first, then his lawyers. His team activated instantly, pulling public records, establishing timelines, gathering witness statements from Avery's colleagues who had known about the girl's birth. Monica found an old email from Avery to a close friend, one where she said clearly that Graham had no idea he was a father and that she planned to tell him when the time was right. It was something. It wasn't enough. The hardest part came that evening when Graham had to tell the girls that something might be changing. They were sitting on the floor putting together a jigsaw puzzle, Emma humming softly, Sophie deep in focus. He crouched beside them, his voice gentle. "There's something I need to talk to you about," he said. They looked up, both stopped moving. "Your mom's brother, Daniel. He found out you're with me. He thinks you should live with him instead." For a moment the room felt hollow. Sophie's eyes darkened. Emma blinked, confused. "Do we have to go?" Emma asked, voice trembling. "No," he said quickly. "I'm going to do everything I can to make sure you stay right here." Sophie didn't speak for a long time. Then finally, she said, "He yelled at Mommy a lot. We used to hide under the table when he visited." Graham felt his chest tighten. "She didn't like him," Sophie added. "She told us if anything ever happened we should find you." That night Graham sat at his desk long after the girls had gone to sleep, staring at the birth certificates, the medical forms, the scribbled artwork that now covered his refrigerator. He wasn't fighting for custody. He was fighting for his daughters, for their peace, for the right to be the father they had already chosen. He didn't care how long the legal battle would take or how ugly it would get. He had made up his mind. They were not going anywhere, and neither was he. The courtroom was colder than Graham expected, not just in temperature but in tone. Sterile walls, muted lighting, and rows of benches made everything feel distant and impersonal, as if the fate of two small children wasn't about to be debated in front of strangers. He sat at the long table beside his legal team, wearing a suit that suddenly felt more like armor than attire. Across from him sat Daniel Moore, shoulders squared with artificial confidence, eyes scanning the room like a predator waiting to strike. He looked nothing like Avery. There was no warmth in his face, no trace of the woman Graham once loved, just ego and entitlement wrapped in a practiced frown. Sophie and Emma weren't present. Graham had insisted they stay home with Monica. They didn't need to hear strangers dissect their lives like a business transaction, but their absence didn't make it easier. In fact, it made it worse. Every argument, every accusation thrown at him felt like a threat echoing into the rooms they now slept in. The girls had finally started calling the penthouse home, and this man, this stranger, wanted to take that away. Daniel's lawyer spoke first. He presented documents, old photographs, statements from distant relatives who barely knew the girls. He painted Daniel as the only blood relative fit to care For them, someone with a longing to reconnect and a deep familial bond. Graham's stomach turned at the performance. The truth was that Daniel had never once reached out, not to Avery, not to the girls, and yet here he was claiming a right that biology alone did not grant. Then came the character attacks, cold calculated hits to Graham's reputation. The lawyer called him emotionally detached, career-obsessed, financially generous but personally distant. They referenced articles from years past that described him as ruthless, unfeeling, robotic, and Graham sat through it all, jaw-tight, fists clenched beneath the table, because none of it mattered if he couldn't prove who he was. Now, when it was his turn to speak, Graham stood slowly, buttoned his jacket, and walked to the center of the room. He didn't hold papers, didn't read from a script. He looked directly at the judge. "I never knew I had children," he began, his voice steady but quiet. "Not because I didn't care, because I wasn't told." He paused, letting the silence fill the space. "When I met Sophie and Emma, they didn't ask me for anything, not toys, not money, not love. They didn't expect it, which tells me they've lived without it for longer than they should have. But they're not just surviving anymore, they're becoming who they're meant to be. They sing, they ask questions, they sleep through the night, they laugh, they trust." His voice faltered slightly, just enough to reveal what was underneath. "I've spent my life building things, companies, teams, legacies, but none of that means anything if I can't protect the only thing that really matters now, my daughters. I'm not perfect, but I show up every day, and I'll never stop." There was a stillness in the courtroom when he sat back down for the first time. Daniel didn't smirk, he looked uncomfortable, exposed. Then the judge did something unexpected. He asked to speak with the girls. Graham's lawyer hesitated but nodded. They arranged for the girls to come in the next morning for a private conversation in chambers. It wasn't about questioning them, it was about hearing their hearts directly, without legal translation. The next morning, Graham sat in the waiting room outside the judge's office while Sophie and Emma went in. He wasn't allowed to hear what was said, but when they came out, Sophie looked calm, composed, like she'd said exactly what needed to be said. Emma climbed into his lap without a word and rested her head on his chest. That was all he needed to know. Later that afternoon, the judge returned to the courtroom and delivered the ruling. Full custody would be granted to Graham Lawson permanently. There were no dramatic gasps, no thunderous reactions, just a quiet shift in the air, like gravity had settled in the right direction. Daniel stormed out before the final sentence was even spoken, his face tight with defeat. Graham didn't watch him go, he didn't care. He turned to his legal team, shook hands out of habit, thanked them mechanically, but his mind was already at home, already picturing the girls sitting in their pajamas waiting for a bedtime story that night. When he walked through the door, they ran to him before he could even take off his coat. Sophie wrapped her arms around his waist and Emma tugged his hand toward the living room where they had already laid out a book and 2 blankets. Graham sat between them, reading through pages he didn't quite finish because halfway through both girls fell asleep against his sides, warm and heavy and safe, and in that moment he knew that no matter how much he had achieved in his life, nothing would ever come close to this. They were his, and he was theirs. The months that followed settled into a rhythm that was both unfamiliar and strangely natural, as if Graham had spent his whole life preparing for something he didn't even know he wanted. The penthouse no longer felt sterile. The sharp, minimalist lines of the interior were softened with blankets draped over couches, art projects taped proudly to walls, and the sound of 2 little girls filling every corner. There were fingerprints on glass doors, mismatched socks in hallways, and crayon markings on the edge of his otherwise perfect marble countertop. And for the first time in his adult life, he didn't care. In fact, he found comfort in the mess, in the beautiful, chaotic proof that life was finally being lived. Here Sophie and Emma bloomed. There was no other word for it. They had come into his life quiet, careful, and watchful. Now they laughed more easily, asked for things without apologizing, and fell asleep without needing to check that he was still nearby. Sophie began writing stories, small thoughtful pieces about brave girls and magical forests. She kept them in a blue notebook and let Graham read them every Sunday night. Emma started drawing her own versions of the characters, taping them to the refrigerator with sparkly stickers. Their imaginations grew bolder every day, and Graham did his best to keep up, even if that meant sitting through elaborate performances of made-up plays or helping design official princess detective badges out of cardboard and ribbon. Graham's own life shifted in ways that couldn't be measured on spreadsheets. He began spending less time in boardrooms and more time in classrooms, parent-teacher meetings, art shows, school plays. He learned how to braid hair with clumsy fingers, how to explain multiplication in a way that made it sound like magic, and how to sit on the floor for hours building puzzles that tested his patience more than any corporate merger ever had. He wasn't just parenting, he was connecting. And in the process he was being remade professionally. He took a step back. He no longer chased growth for the sake of growth. His company ran well without him at the helm every single day. Instead, he poured his time and resources into something new, something rooted in Love not ambition. He founded the Avery Foundation in honor of the woman who had carried so much of the weight alone. The organization focused on supporting single mothers, families in crisis, and children without stable homes. It was his way of saying thank you to Avery and of making sure her daughters knew her legacy was alive and more than just memory. The girls were involved from the very beginning. Sophie helped name the foundation. Emma picked the colors for the logo, shades of blue and green, because those are peaceful, she said. Graham included them in meetings when he could, letting them see how their story could ripple outward to help others. People reached out from all over the country, sharing letters, photos, even their own stories of reconnecting with lost family. It was bigger than he expected, and yet it felt entirely personal. What surprised Graham the most was how easily he let go of the man he used to be. There was no mourning for his old life, no longing for the silence or the solitude. That world had been made of glass, beautiful but fragile, cold and empty. This new life, though unpredictable and often exhausting, had weight and texture and meaning. He no longer measured success by net worth or quarterly returns. He measured it by giggles during bedtime stories, by how tightly Emma held his hand in parking lots, by the way Sophie leaned her head on his shoulder when they watched movies one night long after the girls had gone to bed and the city had gone quiet. Graham stood on the balcony and looked out over the skyline. It glittered with the same brilliance it always had, but something about it felt smaller now, or maybe he had just grown bigger in the ways that mattered. He thought about everything it took to get here, the loss, the shock, the fear. He thought about Avery and the impossible choices she made, and most of all he thought about two girls with identical birthmarks who had walked into a restaurant one night and, without even realizing it, handed him back his heart. He had spent a lifetime building a future, and now finally he was living in it. The morning of their 7th birthday began with sunlight pouring through the curtains and the smell of cinnamon drifting through the apartment. Graham had woken up earlier than usual, with a quiet buzz of nerves in his chest. He wasn't a man easily shaken. He had negotiated billion-dollar deals under pressure, stood before entire auditoriums with poise, but this was different. This mattered more than any quarterly report or market win. Today wasn't about celebration for celebration's sake. It was about presence, about showing two little girls that someone remembered, that someone cared, that they mattered fully and completely. The kitchen was a mess. Flour on the counters, sticky batter on his sleeves, the oven beeping every few minutes like a reminder that he still had no business baking unsupervised, but he didn't care. He was making them a cake himself, the way he promised weeks ago. Sophie had requested vanilla with strawberries. Emma had insisted on chocolate chips, so he'd found a way to do both. The result wasn't elegant. It sagged a little on one side, and the frosting looked like it had been applied by someone wearing a blindfold, but it was made with real effort, and he knew they'd see that by the time the girls woke up. The living room had been transformed. Balloons floated in clusters strung with ribbons across the ceiling, a paper banner that read "Happy Birthday Sophie and Emma" in his own messy handwriting hung above the couch. Gifts were stacked in a pile by the window, not expensive gadgets or flashy toys, but things that meant something. Books they'd talked about, sketch pads, a set of walkie-talkies they'd seen at the store and whispered about like they were spy gear, a new set of pajamas with matching moon patterns, because they still loved falling asleep in the same bed some nights, especially when it rained. When they saw it all, they didn't scream with excitement or run wildly through the room. They just stood in the doorway for a moment, still in their pajamas, eyes wide and shining. Then they turned to him slowly, as if making sure this wasn't a dream. He knelt down and opened his arms, and they both ran into them at once. No words, no overreactions, just 3 heartbeats aligning in one quiet embrace. The rest of the day unfolded in bursts of color and warmth. There was laughter, cake everywhere, frosting on noses and cheeks. Monica stopped by with party hats and a handmade card that Emma declared was the most beautiful thing ever. A few friends from school arrived with their parents for a small backyard-style gathering on the rooftop garden. There were games, music, and stories, and Graham stood off to the side for a while, just watching, trying to take it all in without blinking too much, because every moment felt precious, like something that could vanish if he didn't hold on to it tightly. Enough that evening, after the last guest had left and the sky had turned to soft shades of purple and gold, Graham called the girls into the living room one more time. He handed them each a small velvet box. Inside were matching silver lockets, simple and elegant, engraved with their initials on the front. Inside each locket he had placed a tiny photo of the 3 of them together, taken only a few weeks ago. On the opposite side, engraved in delicate script, was the same phrase in both: "You are my always." Sophie stared at hers for a long time, running her fingers over the engraving. Emma immediately opened hers, smiled, then closed it and clutched it to her chest. They looked up at him at the same time. Sophie's voice was quiet when she spoke. "We weren't sure what to call you before Emma nodded beside her. Yeah, we didn't know if it was okay. Graham swallowed the lump rising in his throat. But now, Sophie continued, can we call you Dad? He couldn't speak at first, his heart was too full, his throat too tight, so he simply nodded and pulled them both into his arms again, holding them so close it felt like he was anchoring his soul to something solid for the first time in his life. That night after they had fallen asleep, Sophie with her notebook beside her pillow, Emma still wearing her locket, Graham stood in the doorway and just watched them breathe. The city beyond the window glittered quietly, but it no longer felt like the center of the world. The center of his world was right there, two small girls with matching curls, matching birthmarks, and a love so pure it had completely rewritten who he was. He thought back to the man he used to be, sharp edges, empty apartment, long nights, and longer silences, and then he thought of the moment he saw those girls standing in a restaurant showing him something he didn't know he was missing. They hadn't just told him the truth that night, they'd saved him with it. What makes this story linger long after the final page isn't just the transformation of a powerful man, it's the quiet, undeniable truth that love has a way of finding us even when we've spent years hiding from it. Graham Lawson didn't just gain daughters, he rediscovered his humanity. He learned that real strength isn't in control or achievement but in vulnerability and presence, in choosing to stay. It's not a fairy tale, it's something better. It's a reminder that healing often arrives disguised as responsibility, that family can begin in the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the people who save us are the ones we never saw coming.